The chains rattled in the silent night. The master screamed, his voice muffled by dirt filling the pit beneath him. Above, a slave, once beaten, once broken, now stood tall, shoveling earth onto the man who had ruled his life with cruelty. The plantation house glowed in the distance, its windows lit for the Christmas feast, while deep in the fields, a grave was being filled. What happened that night in 1829 shocked the South and still haunts history's darkest corners. The year was 1829, and the Mississippi sun was merciless. It baked the cotton fields until the soil cracked, turning the earth into dust that clung to the lungs of every slave who bent to pick the endless white tufts. This was the Fairchild Plantation, a place whispered about even beyond its wooden fences. Other enslaved men and women, when passing news along the hidden networks of whispers and hymns, spoke its name with fear. For Fairchild's land was not just a plantation. It was a prison of cruelty, a place where even hope was strangled by chains. At the heart of it all stood Charles Fairchild, the master. To the outside world he appeared as a gentleman of fortune, a man who dressed in fine coats imported from New Orleans, whose boots were always polished to a mirror shine. But to the enslaved he was something else entirely. They knew him by another name, the Devil with a Cane. The nickname came from the long, carved stick he carried everywhere, a piece of polished oak, topped with a silver handle. Though he claimed it steadied his walk, the truth was known to all. That cane had struck more flesh than it had ever struck earth. Samuel, one of the strongest men on the plantation, bore scars on his back that told the story. Born into slavery on Fairchild land, Samuel had never known freedom. His first memory was not of his mother's lullaby or of laughter, but of her screams. He had been only 5 years old when she was sold away, pulled from his arms as he clung desperately to the hem of her dress. He remembered the dust cloud rising as the wagon carried her away, remembered the overseer's whip lashing his tiny hands when he refused to let go. From that moment forward, Samuel learned that the chains around him were not only made of iron, but of loss. The plantation was a world in itself. At dawn, the overseer's horn echoed across the fields, dragging men, women, and even children into rows that stretched farther than the eye could see. Overseer Harlan, a man as ruthless as the master, rode horseback with a whip coiled at his side, his eyes searching for weakness. He ruled the fields like a hawk circling prey, striking without hesitation. Every crack of his whip was a sentence delivered, every scar a permanent reminder of the cost of slowing down. Samuel learned to endure. His hands toughened, his body hardened, but his spirit bent like the cane stalks in the wind. There were nights when he lay on the dirt floor of the slave quarters, listening to the groans of the weary, the cries of the hungry children, and the whispers of hymns sung softly under the stars. Those hymns carried secret messages of hope, of freedom, of a land beyond the river where no chains rattled. Samuel listened, but part of him doubted. Freedom seemed like a story for other men, not for him. Mistress Eleanor Fairchild was no less feared. With her pale face and sharp blue eyes, she carried herself as a queen in her kingdom of suffering. Her cruelty came not with whips, but with silence. When she found fault, it was not always with pain, but with denial. A child who spilled water might find herself without food for 2 days. A mother who disobeyed would have her child taken away, brought into the big house to serve as a house slave, stripped of her family. Eleanor believed in punishment through deprivation, and her methods left scars deeper than flesh. One winter, Samuel had witnessed a moment that branded itself into his mind. It was Christmas Eve, and the great feast was prepared inside the big house. Roasted meats filled the air with their heavy aroma, pies cooled on the windowsills, and laughter echoed from within. Outside, the slaves were ordered to stand at a distance, working even on that night. Samuel saw a young child, no more than 7, crawl toward the kitchen door, drawn by the smell of bread. The mistress spotted him, her face curling into disgust. She signaled to the overseer, who struck the child so hard with his boot that the boy crumpled. The sound of laughter swelled inside the hall, while the boy whimpered in the dirt. Samuel clenched his fists that night, so tightly his nails drew blood from his palms. The plantation was not just a place of work, it was a place of death. Samuel had seen men hanged in chains for trying to escape, their bodies left to rot as warnings. He had seen women buried in shallow graves after collapsing in the fields, their names whispered only in secret so the memory of them might live on. The land itself seemed haunted, each tree heavy with the weight of unseen sorrow. And yet, Samuel survived. Year after year, lash after lash, he endured. But survival came at a cost. The boy who once cried for his mother had become a man of silence, his face a mask, his emotions buried beneath layers of endurance. Still, in the quietest hours of night, when the wind carried the smell of damp earth and the stars hung heavy overhead, Samuel's mind wandered. He thought of freedom, yes, but more often, he thought of vengeance. Samuel was not reckless. He watched, he studied. He knew the master's habits, the way he drank too much wine during feasts, the way he stumbled outside to relieve himself near the fields, the way he trusted his overseer, but never his slaves. He noticed the soil near the far edge of the plantation, softer, looser than the rest, where the ground seemed to swallow water after heavy rains. It was the place where slaves who died were buried quickly, without ceremony, without dignity. Samuel knew that soil well, for he had dug graves there with his own hands. It was in that very soil, he thought, that justice might one day be written. The thought came to him slowly, like a seed planted in darkness. But over the years it grew, watered by every lash, every stolen life, every insult thrown like a stone. He could not escape, not with dogs patrolling the borders, not with bounty hunters lurking in every town. But if he could not run, he could strike. He could make the land itself swallow the man who had devoured so many lives. Still, Samuel waited. Patience was his only shield. For a slave, one mistake meant death, and death without purpose was a wasted end. He bided his time, enduring through seasons of planting and seasons of harvest, through summers that scorched and winters that froze. He waited for the perfect moment. And that moment, Samuel realized, would come when the master was at his weakest, during the Christmas feast of 1829. Because on that night, while laughter filled the great house and music drowned the air, Samuel planned to turn the soil of sorrow into the soil of revenge. But no one, not the overseer, not the mistress, not even the other slaves, could have imagined the darkness that was about to unfold on the plantation's darkest night. The year 1829 pressed down on the Fairchild plantation with a heaviness that seemed to seep into the very air. Winter had come early, biting at the bones of the slaves who worked the fields from dawn until nightfall. The overseer's horn still blew before the sun's first light, summoning weary bodies into endless rows. But this year, the work was harsher than ever, and so were the punishments. The cotton harvest had been poor, the frost cutting the yield nearly in half. Master Charles Fairchild, already a man of violent temper, grew bitter. His anger fell upon the slaves like a storm that never ended. He believed that when the land failed him, it was the fault of the hands that worked it. And so the lash grew busier, the punishments longer, the rations smaller. Samuel endured each day, but he saw suffering around him deepen in ways that ignited a fire inside his chest. One morning, a young woman named Ruth dropped a basket of cotton. Her hands were raw, her fingers bleeding from the sharp edges of the bowls. The overseer, Harlan, saw the slip and seized the moment. He dragged her by her hair to a post in the middle of the field and tied her hands high above her head. With the master watching from horseback, Harlan whipped her until the ground beneath her was spotted red. Ruth collapsed, her screams echoing across the rows. The slaves were forced to watch, and Samuel's jaw tightened as he fought back the urge to break from the line. That night, as the slaves returned to their quarters, Ruth's sobs carried through the darkness. Samuel lay on the dirt floor, staring at the wooden beams above, listening. Every cry she made drove another nail into the coffin of his patience. The weeks dragged on. The overseer found new ways to humiliate. He took pleasure in beating men in front of their wives, or stripping women of dignity by forcing them to serve in the house during feasts, only to be mocked by the mistress. Samuel saw men collapse from exhaustion, only to be kicked until they rose again. He saw women begging for scraps, denied even a crust of bread. He saw children punished for being children. One day, a boy no older than 12 was accused of stealing an apple. His small hands clutched at his shirt, shaking as the master called for punishment. The boy was chained to a tree in the yard and left in the hot sun, hanging by his arms until his tiny body gave out. Samuel, working nearby, could do nothing but watch as the child's legs went limp. By the time the overseer cut him down, it was too late. The boy's lifeless body crumpled in the dust, his eyes still open as if asking why. Samuel carried that image with him. It haunted his dreams, his waking thoughts, his every moment in the fields. The cruelty was no longer just survival. It was fuel. Each lash Samuel bore no longer pushed him deeper into despair. It hardened him, sharpened him like a blade waiting to strike. He began to think less of endurance and more of justice. But justice on a plantation was death. Any slave who raised a hand against his master was hanged, burned, or worse. Samuel had seen the consequences. There had been a man once, years before, who tried to escape. He was caught, dragged back in chains, and tied to a tree in the yard. The master ordered firewood stacked at his feet. Before the eyes of every slave, he was burned alive, his screams searing themselves into Samuel's memory. His charred body was left for days, a message written in flame. This is what happens when you defy. And yet, Samuel no longer cared about death. What was life if it was only chains, only hunger, only beatings, only the loss of everyone you loved? He had survived long enough to understand one truth. Survival without dignity was another kind of death. And so, his thoughts began to shift. If death would come for him no matter what, then why not meet it with fire in his hands? Why not drag the devil with a cane down into the dirt before he went? The plan formed slowly, carefully. Samuel knew the master's patterns. He knew that during the Christmas feast, Fairchild drank too much. He knew the master liked to stumble outside, cane tapping against the frosty ground, muttering to himself as the party continued inside. He knew the overseer would be distracted, laughing with the other white men, leaving the master alone in his drunken pride. Samuel began to prepare. Quietly, secretly, patiently. In the fields, when no one watched, he tested the soil near the burial ground. It was loose, easy to dig. He dug at night, his hands blistered but silent, carving out a pit just deep enough. He covered it carefully, leaving the earth looking undisturbed. No one suspected. To anyone else, it was just another patch of dirt among thousands. But to Samuel, it was destiny waiting. He also found an old length of iron chain near the smith's shed, discarded after it had rusted through in one link. Samuel cleaned it, wrapped it in cloth, and hid it in the shadows of the barn. The weight of it in his hands gave him comfort, a promise that when the time came, he would not hesitate. As the days drew closer to Christmas, Samuel's heart beat heavier. He worked in silence, his eyes fixed, his body obedient, but his mind burned with thoughts of the night to come. Others noticed the stillness in him. Ruth, still scarred from her whipping, whispered to him one evening, "You're too quiet, Samuel. What's in your mind?" He only shook his head, staring into the fire. For the less others knew, the safer they were. This was not their burden. This was his alone. Each passing day, Samuel replayed it in his mind, the moment when the master would stumble into the night, the sound of the chain striking, the weight of a man dragged into earth. He could almost hear the soil falling, smell the dampness of the grave. And yet part of him wondered, would he succeed? Or would he, too, be strung up, hanged in chains, his body left to rot as a warning? But Samuel no longer feared. The time for fear was gone. All that remained was resolve. As Christmas approached, and the great house prepared for its feast, Samuel whispered to himself in the dark of the quarters, "This year, the devil will not drink again." Christmas night, 1829. The plantation glowed like a lantern in the darkness. From the grand house, the warm flicker of candlelight spilled through tall windows. Music drifted across the frozen fields, violins and flutes playing merrily as if suffering did not exist just beyond those walls. Inside, the Fairchild's annual feast was in full bloom. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted turkey, ham glazed with honey, bowls of steaming potatoes, and pies lined in perfect rows. Wine flowed endlessly, and laughter filled the air. But outside, in the bitter night, the slaves huddled in their quarters with nothing but scraps. A few crusts of stale bread, a thin stew boiled from bones, this was their feast. Their bellies growled even as the wind carried the scent of roasted meat to their nostrils, a cruel reminder of what they were denied. Children cried softly in the dark, mothers rocking them with whispered hymns to drown the hunger. Samuel sat apart, near the doorway of the quarters, watching the glow of the house. His face was calm, but inside, his chest thundered. For years, he had endured. For years, he had been beaten, chained, silenced. But tonight would be different. He had prepared for this moment with the patience of a man who knew there would only ever be one chance. Days before, he had dug the pit in the loose earth by the burial ground. Tonight, the grave waited. Hidden in the barn, wrapped in cloth, lay the length of iron chain. Every detail had been set in motion, waiting only for the master to stumble into the night. Inside the house, Master Charles Fairchild laughed louder than any guest. His cheeks glowed red from drink, his eyes heavy but wild. He pounded the table with his silver-tipped cane, boasting about his land, his wealth, and his power. "Even the Lord himself blesses my hand," he roared, raising a glass of wine. "My slaves are strong, my overseer loyal, my plantation the finest in all Mississippi." The guests cheered, their voices a chorus of privilege. Eleanor, the mistress, smiled with thin lips, her cold eyes shining in the candlelight. Overseer Harlan sat at the far end of the table, laughing along, though his eyes never left his master's wine glass, making sure it stayed full. The night grew late. One by one, the guests began to leave, their carriages rolling away into the frosty dark. The laughter grew quieter, the music dimmed, and soon only the master remained, drunker than ever, staggering to his feet. "One last walk in my fields," he muttered, gripping his cane as if it were a crown. He pushed past the servants, ignoring Eleanor's sharp warning, and stepped out into the cold. This was the moment Samuel had been waiting for. From the shadows of the barn, he emerged, his body tense, his heart hammering like a drum. The chain was hidden beneath his ragged coat, its weight pressing against his side. He moved silently, the way only a slave who had learned to disappear into the night could move. The master's boots crunched against the frozen earth, his cane tapping rhythmically with each uneven step. He walked toward the fields, muttering drunkenly, his breath forming small clouds in the icy air. He was alone. The overseer was inside, the mistress busy scolding a servant. No one followed. Samuel's hands tightened on the chain. For years he had dreamed of this night, imagined it over and over in his mind. But dreams were never like reality. Now, every sound seemed louder, the wind rattling dry stalks in the field, the thump of the master's boots, the pounding of Samuel's own heart. The master stopped near the edge of the field, where the land dipped slightly, where the earth was looser. He leaned against his cane, humming a drunken tune. His back was turned. Samuel stepped closer, his breath shallow, his grip tightening. The master turned suddenly, his bleary eyes catching the shadow in the dark. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice sharp despite the drink. He raised his cane, but before he could strike, Samuel swung the chain. The iron crashed against the master's skull with a sickening thud. The cane fell. Fairchild staggered, his mouth open in shock, his body crumpling to the ground. For a moment, Samuel froze. His hands trembled, his chest heaving. The master groaned, rolling onto his side, clutching at his head. He was alive. Samuel moved quickly. He wrapped the chain around Fairchild's wrists, binding them tight. The master thrashed, cursing, but his words slurred from the blow. Samuel dragged him across the frozen ground, his muscles burning with effort, the weight of the man heavier than stone. The pit waited. Fairchild realized what was happening too late. His voice, once booming with authority, now cracked with fear. "You'll hang for this, boy," he screamed, his eyes wide. "You'll be hanged in chains." Samuel said nothing. His silence was louder than any words. He forced the master into the pit, shoving him down into the earth that had swallowed so many slaves before. Fairchild thrashed, his face twisting in terror. "No, no! You dare defy me? I am your master. I own you." His voice rose to a desperate shriek, echoing across the cold night. Samuel grabbed the shovel he had hidden nearby. His hands gripped it tight. He stared down at the man who had stolen his mother, whipped his back, starved his brothers, killed his people. The devil with a cane now lay in the dirt, his silver handle glinting in the moonlight. And Samuel began to shovel. The first scoop of earth hit the master's chest. He screamed. Another scoop fell, covering his legs. He thrashed wildly, but the chains held firm. Samuel's breath came hard, his muscles straining, but he did not stop. Dirt fell faster and faster. The master's voice grew shriller, rising into the night. He begged. He cursed. He called on God. But the soil drowned his words, each shovelful muffling his cries. Finally, only his face remained above the pit, his eyes wide, his mouth gasping. "Samuel, please!" Samuel dropped the last scoop. The earth swallowed the master whole. Silence fell across the field, broken only by Samuel's ragged breathing and the faint whisper of the wind. For the first time in his life, Samuel felt no chains on his soul. But what he would do next would decide whether this night ended in freedom or in fire. The night had never felt so still. The distant glow of the great house flickered faintly against the horizon, its laughter and music now long faded into silence. The frost bit at Samuel's skin, but he barely felt the cold. Every nerve, every vein, every beat of his heart was alive with fire. The pit was no longer just a hole in the earth. It was the stage where years of torment, hunger, and chains came to end. Samuel stood above it, shovel in hand, staring down into the eyes of Charles Fairchild, the master who had claimed to own his life, who had stolen the lives of so many others, now writhed helplessly in the grave that had been dug for him. The silver-tipped cane lay discarded in the frost, its polished shine dim under the moonlight. Samuel looked at it once, then kicked it into the shadows. Tonight, the cane would strike no more flesh. Fairchild's face twisted in rage and terror. "You'll burn for this, slave," he spat, his voice shrill. "You'll be hanged, your body left to rot. Do you hear me? Hanged in chains until the crows pick you clean." Samuel did not answer. His silence was more terrifying than words. His chest rose and fell, each breath steaming into the night, but his eyes were steady, locked on the man below. He lifted the shovel. The first scoop of earth was heavy, the soil damp and cold. He tossed it into the pit. It landed with a dull thud against Fairchild's chest. The master's eyes widened, his face blanching. "No!" he shrieked, thrashing against the chain that bound his wrists. "Stop this madness! I am your master." Another scoop of earth fell, covering his legs. Samuel's movements grew faster, more determined. Each shovelful was a memory, his mother being dragged away, Ruth's blood staining the field, the boy hanging lifeless in the sun. Every scar on Samuel's back seemed to burn with each motion, urging him onward. Fairchild kicked, sending dirt scattering, but Samuel's resolve was stronger. The chain rattled as the master struggled, but the sound was drowned by the steady scrape of the shovel against soil. "You'll kill us all!" Fairchild screamed, his voice cracking. "The overseer will find me. He'll bury you alive instead." Samuel paused only for a heartbeat, his hands tightening around the shovel. Buried alive. The words echoed in his skull. That was the fate of many slaves, buried without name, without prayer, without dignity. But tonight, the soil claimed a different body. Tonight, the master would taste the earth of the graves he had filled. He shoveled faster. Dirt rained down over Fairchild's body, climbing higher up his chest, pressing into his sides. The master's screams grew muffled, his curses turning into pleas. "Please, Samuel. Mercy, mercy. I'll spare you. I'll give you food, freedom." Samuel froze, the shovel heavy in his hands. Freedom? From this man? His jaw clenched, and for the first time that night, he spoke. His voice was low, rough from years of silence, but steady. "You took my mother. You whipped my back. You killed my brothers. You left children to die in the fields." Fairchild's eyes widened, his mouth trembling. Samuel's voice grew harder. "You are no master. You are no man. Tonight, the earth takes you." And he shoveled again. The dirt reached Fairchild's neck. His face twisted in terror, his head thrashing side to side as the soil closed in. His muffled cries turned into animal sounds, raw and desperate. His breath came in short bursts, his chest heaving against the weight pressing down. Samuel's arms ached, his body screamed with exhaustion, but he did not stop. He shoveled like a man possessed, every motion powered by years of rage. The soil climbed higher, swallowing the master inch by inch. At last, only Fairchild's face remained above the pit. His eyes darted wildly, glistening with tears, his mouth gasping for air. "Samuel," he choked. "Please, don't." Samuel leaned closer, staring into those terrified eyes. For years, he had looked up into them from chains, from hunger, from the lash. Now, for the first time, he looked down. And then, with one final scoop, he covered the master's face. The soil fell heavy, smothering the last cry. The pit went silent. The only sound left was the shovel scraping earth and the steady, rhythmic thump as Samuel buried his master completely. Minutes passed. Samuel's arms moved without thought, his body numb, his mind burning. He shoveled until the pit was filled, until the ground was level, until there was no sign of the man beneath. Silence. Only the whisper of the wind remained. Samuel stood still, breathing hard, staring at the mound of fresh soil. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he had done. His hands shook around the wooden handle, dirt clinging to his skin, sweat freezing on his brow. For a moment, he felt the night shift. The plantation, once suffocating, felt lighter. The air no longer carried only the smell of suffering, but something else, something sharp, something free. But freedom was dangerous. The overseer would notice the master missing. The mistress would scream for vengeance. The slaves would be questioned, beaten, tortured until someone spoke. The grave could not remain hidden forever. Samuel dropped the shovel, the sound echoing like thunder in the stillness. He stood over the mound, his chest heaving, his face lifted to the cold night sky. The stars glittered above, silent witnesses to the act that had just unfolded. For the first time, Samuel whispered words, not to his master, not to himself, but to the earth. It is done. The night seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, a dog barked. A lantern flickered in the window of the big house. Samuel knew time was slipping. He could not linger. The grave was filled, but his fate was not yet decided. Would he flee into the darkness, chasing a freedom he had never known? Or would he stay, risk discovery, and face a punishment more terrible than death? He turned toward the shadow of the fields, the endless rows stretching into the night. His body was exhausted, but his spirit felt sharper than ever before. What Samuel did next would not only determine his fate, but echo through every whisper of every slave who dreamed of chains breaking. The devil with a cane was gone. But the story of Samuel, the slave who buried his master alive, had only just begun. The plantation awoke with screams. At dawn, the great house stirred with chaos. The mistress's voice shrieked across the fields, calling for her husband, for the master who had not returned from the night before. Lanterns swung wildly, dogs barked, overseers stormed through the cabins. Every slave was dragged from their sleep, lined up under the biting morning sun, their faces studied for guilt. Samuel stood among them, silent, his expression carved from stone. His hands were blistered, raw from the shovel, but he kept them hidden in the folds of his trousers. His heart thundered, but his face betrayed nothing. The overseer, cane in hand, spat curses as he paced before the trembling slaves. "One of you knows where he is," he barked. "And by God, I'll find out." The lash came quickly. Men were stripped, women were struck, children screamed as leather tore through the air. The overseer's fury was unmatched. His master was missing, and suspicion hung heavy. Every cry of pain was meant to shake loose the truth. But the truth lay buried. Samuel's eyes flicked toward the field, toward the patch of earth where the soil was still darker, still fresh. Every moment felt like a knife at his throat, every shout like a shovel unearthing what he had tried so desperately to hide. But he stood steady. He had faced whips, chains, hunger, grief. He could face this. Days passed, and the search grew frantic. The mistress wailed, insisting her husband had been taken by runaway slaves. Posses were formed, torches lit, hounds unleashed into the woods. But the master was not in the woods. He was not on the roads, nor chained in another man's wagon. He was here, on his own land, beneath the very earth he had forced others to plow. The irony was bitter and beautiful. Yet with each day, Samuel knew the danger deepened. Rumors began to spread among the slaves, quiet whispers in the dark cabins, murmurs exchanged in the cotton rows. Some said the master had been swallowed by the devil himself. Others claimed he had been poisoned during the Christmas feast. But Samuel never spoke. Not once. His silence was both shield and burden. At night, he returned to the mound. He stood over it in the moonlight, staring at the soil that covered the body. He felt no joy, no triumph, only a strange stillness, like a storm that had passed but left the air heavy and unsettled. He had buried a man, but he had not buried the chains that still bound him. One evening, an older slave named Miriam touched his shoulder as he lingered too long in the shadows. Her eyes, lined with years of sorrow, studied him with quiet knowing. She said nothing, but her gaze carried a message. "I see you. I know." Samuel looked away, but the truth sat heavy between them. For the first time, he wondered if what he had done was truly his secret, or if the land itself whispered it through the fields, carrying it on the wind to ears that needed to hear. Weeks turned to months. No master returned. The plantation shifted like a ship without a captain. The overseer tightened his grip, crueler than ever, but his authority was hollow. The mistress, pale and frantic, prayed endlessly in the church, her cries echoing through empty pews. But nothing could unearth the grave Samuel had made. And yet, the price of vengeance is never paid once. The image of the burial never left Samuel's mind. At night, he heard the muffled cries beneath the soil. He saw the wide, terrified eyes, the mouth gasping for air as dirt closed in. He had silenced the master, but the echo lived in him. Some nights, he woke drenched in sweat, his hands clawing at the sheets as though he were the one buried alive. But when dawn broke and he stood in the fields once more, the memory steeled him. It reminded him of who he was no longer. He was not just a slave. He was the man who had buried his master alive. The act became a legend, though never spoken aloud in the open. Whispers spread quietly from cabin to cabin, plantation to plantation. Slaves in the distance heard of the dark night when the earth claimed a master. The details blurred, but the essence remained. Resistance was possible. Vengeance was real. Samuel remained on the plantation for years, his secret never uncovered. He worked the fields, bowed his head, endured the overseer's lash, but inside, he carried a fire no chain could smother. He had written his defiance not on paper, not in speeches, but in the soil itself. And when the day finally came, years later, when whispers of freedom swept across the land, Samuel did not rise as a broken man. He rose as one who had already taken his stand, one who had already carved justice from the earth with his own hands. The plantation's darkest night had become his light. History remembers the chains, the whips, the cruelty. But in the shadows, in the silence, there were moments like this, moments when the enslaved seized their own justice. Samuel's name may be forgotten in the records, but his act was not. The slave who buried his master alive left behind more than a grave. He left behind a whisper of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest night, vengeance could rise from the earth itself.